Welcome back. In this video we're going to look at a collection of some of the other nodes that I find really useful when doing procedural texturing. Okay, so we're back in the node explanation examples file and we're in the scene layer called utility nodes. And if you don't see this shader, just make sure you click on Suzanne and that will appear. Now let's just quickly go through the mapping nodes. There are only two of these, one if you're just using a UV, and if you have more than one UV unwrap on an object, you'll find the name of it just in this drop down. The second node here is texture coordinate. This allows you to use generated, normal, UV, object, camera, window and reflection maps. In general, we're going to be using object UVs for the most part because it means we won't have to unwrap our objects, and our procedural textures should work on any object we choose. The next set of nodes we're going to look at are the separate and combine nodes. So we have two different separate and combine nodes. We have separate color and separate vector. These take in either RGB values and break them into individual red, green and blue channels, or they take in vector coordinates and break them into X, Y and Z coordinates. We can then adjust individual channels of red, green and blue, or individual coordinates, using many other techniques including mix nodes, noise maps, value nodes, math nodes and a whole bunch of other techniques. And then we can recombine them and spit out another RGB value or another set of vector coordinates. Both of these come in really useful when doing procedural texturing. The next set of nodes that we're going to look at are the value and RGB nodes. These are all ones that output different either values or RGB colours depending on what you choose. We have wireframe, which triangulates our object and then gives us a wireframe on our mesh. So it's not really a true wireframe because these should really be polygons, but instead we're getting triangles. We have the value node, which just gives us a value. This is really useful if you ever have to work with math nodes because you can just put in whichever value you want. So with the Fresnel node, what we have is we have the ability to have white on edges that we are looking at a very acute angle. So they're almost parallel to the direction of the camera. And then we have these darker areas that are faces that are pointing towards the camera. We can use index of refraction to change the blend of those. We also have the layer weight node, which also has a Fresnel output, and you can see this is very similar to the Fresnel node itself, but it also has an additional node called facing. So instead of picking out the Fresnel angles, we can actually pick out the faces with a little bit more accuracy. Finally, we have the RGB node, and simply put, this just spits out an RGB value, which you can choose just with the classic color picker, and feel free to change that to hue, saturation and value, or plug in a hex combination there as well. The next set of nodes that we're going to look at are the color nodes. So I've arranged them all in this frame and I've plugged in this magic texture just so we have plenty RGB values to work with. So let's zoom in a little bit, and first of all let's look at the first three: brightness and contrast, invert, gamma. So let's use Ctrl, Shift and left click to connect that. Brightness adds value to each of your RGB channels, and as such it makes your object a lot brighter. If we take it down, it gets darker because we take value away from that, and eventually it will just go to black. Contrast is a little bit tricky. If we increase contrast, we get more contrasting colours. They also get very saturated. The default for contrast is at 0. If we take contrast to -1, we actually get a completely grey image without any contrast whatsoever. And if we actually take it to -2, we actually get the inverse of whatever we put in. So if I take this and compare it to the invert node, you can see they're both completely identical. Gamma is very similar to brightness and contrast. However, in this case, if we decrease the gamma, it brightens our texture, and if we increase it, it darkens it and makes it more saturated. The hue, saturation and value node can be quite useful if you want to just shift the hue of some colours. So if we grab this hue and just change it around, you can see all our colours go from pink to purple to blue to green to yellow, and then back to red, pink, purple. They just go around the colour wheel as we move the hue. Saturation allows us to add either more saturation to our colours or to take it away and make it black and white. And the value node either lets us darken or lighten our colours. So the mix node, while set to colour, is something that we'll be using quite a lot throughout this course, and as such I'm not really going to go into a lot of detail here. The only thing I want to point out really is we have a whole bunch of different options for the way we mix colour, and you can find full details of those in the Blender manual, and I definitely recommend reading up on those. The other thing I want to point out is that we can clamp results. So using some of these techniques, specifically add and subtract, it's quite easy to get values above 1 or values below 0. And you always want to be clamping your result. And that just means that when your map goes further down the node tree, you're not starting to deal with negative values and values above 1, which can cause strange issues in some of your other textures. But again, we're going to be covering the mix node within several more videos in this section. RGB curves allows you to use a curve to change either the complete colour, the R channel, the red channel, the green channel, or the blue channel. So if I wanted to take out some blues, I could just click and drag here. Let's look at the result there. So I can take out some blues and we get some more yellows there. If I want to increase my reds, I can go like this. We can change our angle type. We can accurately put in these points and define where they go. We have a lot of options in here as well for changing the size of this graph. At the moment it just goes from 0 to 1 on both the X and Y axes. But we could actually change new maximum minimum values and start working with graphs with negative numbers or with numbers above 1. However, within procedural texturing, I recommend always trying to keep all the values you use between 0 and 1. We can also click this arrow to reset our view, to reset our scale. We can plug in a factor in order to mask off certain areas or just to use as how much influence this node has. And finally, we have the RGB to black and white. This simply just desaturates your RGB values. The final set of nodes that I'm going to discuss in this video are the value nodes. So these are all nodes that for the most part output a value. So let's dive right into them. I'm using this noise texture so we can see the results of these different nodes. The first node is the clamp node. So this allows you to define what the minimum value being output from this node is and the maximum value. So at the moment we have all values between 0 and 1. If I wanted to make sure there's no values in here below say 0.5, I could click 0.5 into the minimum slot, and you can see all the darker values now get brought up to at least 0.5. We can do the same with max. So let's say I want the maximum value to be 0.8. I can change that, and now all the lighter values in this that were above 0.8 are brought down to 0.8. The color ramp node is again probably the node that we'll be using the most in the entire course. This has a lot of different features. Don't get confused by the black flag and the white flag on this slider. What we want to think about is we want to think about the 0 position on this slider being the value of 0 and the 1 position on this slider being the value of 1. So at the moment we are saying any value that's coming in here that is 0 remains at 0 because our flag is black and has a value of 0. We're saying any value that comes in with a value of 1 is remaining at 1 because white has a value of 1. We could say that we want all the values with 0 to come in and become blue. So let's say we want all our values of 0 now to become blue. So if we plug that in and look at it, you can see all our darker values are now tinted blue. And what we can say here is we want all our values coming in with a value of 1 to become red. So now we have a lot of red in our image, and you can see that anything with a value in between that range now becomes one of these shades. So it's not necessarily about black and white, it's about the value of the nodes. We can add more flags in here. So for example, if I want to take everything incoming with a value of 0.5 to become yellow, and now we have a lot of yellow in our texture, I can move this flag down. So everything at 0.144 should be this perfect yellow color. And then we have now two ranges of colors before and after that could be possible values. So we can move these flags to make whichever adjustments we want to our colors. We also have interpolation types. So instead of a linear fall off, we could have an easing fall off. We could have cardinal, B-spline, which is a really smooth fall off, or we could have constant. So with constant, we now get these solid flags, so we can start actually getting really precise with these values. And one thing about this is we will not get any blurring on these. These are going to be very crisp lines, which can be quite useful for a number of different things. Finally, we have this little arrow here. We can flip our color ramp. So we just take the flags and move them to the opposite end. We can redistribute our stops evenly, and we can reset it. Now, anytime you pick one of these and you're in a color wheel, you do get an eyedropper, which allows you to pick a color from anywhere in the Blender window. It doesn't necessarily have to be an image, but if you do have an image in your image editor, let's just bring up this HDRI image, and let's say I wanted this color here. It's easy enough just to go in and eyedropper that. The next node I want to talk about is the float curve. This is very similar to RGB, but in this case, we are using our curve just on a single value. Now let me take this node, and instead of plugging it into factor, we want it plugged into value. So if I want to make all my mid-range colors a little bit darker, I would just pull this down. Let's say I want to make all the values around about 0.75 perfectly white. We can put in our dot there, change this to 0.75 and change this to 1. And now we get that, and let's just make that a linear fall off. The next node that I want to look at is the map range node. So the map range node works very similar to the color ramp. We can have a from minimum and from maximum setting, and a to minimum and to maximum setting. So what this does is essentially allows us to choose the minimum and maximum output from this node. So by default, it's at 0 and 1, so it's very similar to the range setting on the clamp node. But we also have from min and from max. And what this does is very similar to adding a flag in with black to the 0 position on the color ramp node, and adding a flag with white to the 1 position on the color ramp node. So if I was to take from min to 0.2 and from max to 0.8, that's just like moving the flags closer together and creating a little bit more contrast. Now, unlike the color ramp, we can plug in values to these nodes, which you cannot do on the color ramp. There is only one input value for factor. There are ways to connect drivers to these different settings and run it in a slightly different way. But if you want to be inputting values, the map range node is much easier to use than the color ramp node. We also get the step linear mode, which is very similar to the constant setting in the color ramp. However, you can pick the number of steps as opposed to adding additional flags. We also have another setting called smoother step, which we don't have access to at all in the color ramp, which gives us a very smooth fall off between our different shades. Finally, we have the add node, and just like the mix RGB node, the add node is one of those tricky ones. First off, it's not actually called an add node if you're looking for it. It's in converter, and it's actually called the math node. By default, it comes in as add, but if you click on this, you'll see we actually have dozens of different settings that we can use. Now, some of these are quite straightforward: adding two values together, subtracting two values, multiplying, dividing, etc. Again, I would recommend checking out the Blender manual if you want information on any specific one of those. One thing I will say is, again, with these add and subtract, you do have the opportunity to go above 1 on many of these settings, so I recommend leaving clamp on. You can see we do have a difference in shade. If we turn clamp off, we get these brighter areas. These brighter areas are actually above a value of 1, and that might not be something that you want. Now, the last thing that I want to show you are these useful input nodes. So these are 3 more nodes where there's a couple of settings that I think you should just be made aware of. The geometry node will output vector positions or vector information for a number of different things, but the setting I want to show you is random per island. So the Cezanne monkey head has a single mesh for the head and then a separate mesh for each eye. Now you can see when I plug this in, I get a random value for each of those. This can be really useful for randomizing tiles, bricks, or anything like that if you have a shader on an object made up of many multiple objects or meshes. It's very similar to the random setting in object info, but this is a per object randomness. So you can see the eyes and the skull are the same color. It's not set up per mesh, per separate island. It's set up per separate object. In the light path setting, what's useful about this is we can define a material for if the camera is looking at an object. So here we can see we've got the Cezanne monkey head and we are seeing a value of 1 because it is a camera ray that's looking at it. But in our reflection, we are seeing a black monkey head. And that's because this is not a camera ray that's seeing this monkey head. This is a glossy ray. So if I take this into glossy, you'll see the colours will flip. Now we're seeing this as black and we're seeing this as white. This allows you to set up some really interesting things. So let's finish off the video by showing you an example of that. So I have this additional scene file. And let's just bring it up here. Let's just make this a little bit bigger. So here we have an interior room with a couple of windows and a monkey head, and it looks pretty good. Let's click on our glass object and see what our shader looks like. So this is our one-way glass shader. So what I've done here is I've taken this is camera ray option and I've used it as a factor to mix together a transparent shader and a glass shader. So why have I done that? Why have I used these separate shaders instead of just using glass? Well, if I just use glass, this is the effect I get. Got a lot of noise, the room is not as bright, and we don't have the light coming through and creating those 2 rectangles on the floor the same way we did in this mix shader. Cezanne's not lit up as much. We don't get as much of a nice reflection on the glass. This is what would happen if we used the principled BSDF set to a glass type effect. We get a similar result as far as how bright the room is, but again we still don't get those squares on the ground. So what's happening with this mix shader is, from the camera's point of view we see glass. From the sun lamp's point of view, it doesn't see any shader in these windows, it just reads it as completely transparent. So that's just one very simple example of how you can use light path to make your renders look a little bit better. Okay, it's challenge time. So now that you know about pretty much all the most useful nodes in Blender's shader editor, why don't you try taking any 2 of the procedural texture nodes and combining them using mix nodes? You can change the different settings in the mix node to see what interesting effects you can achieve. You could also use any of the other nodes within your shader tree. Experiment and see what kind of cool effects you can get. If you're unsure about why a setting that you're using does a certain thing, you can always check it out by looking at the Blender manual. In the next video, we're going to move on to creating some more procedural textures. So I'll see you then.